Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you still aboard. Well, uh, of course, you saw that traffic jam at the dock, and you saw how rough the water was this morning. So we just have to have another day of taking it easy aboard. I'm glad to see you all up and ready for my talk early this day. But when you've had a few sea days, there's a special emergency code on the ships for people who say, "Help, I've relaxed and I can't get up." But we'll enjoy the day, and we'll have our next ports in Roatan and Guatemala, Santo Tomas, and then in Belize. So this is a highlight of our trip after Cuba, just to go to this part of the world where I'm sure many of you have been to parts of it. But I call it the Maya land, because this is going to visit places where the Mayan culture was at its former glory, but it's still a living culture. And I'm going to give a talk just about that on our way from Belize to Costa Maya, where we'll go see more of the remnants of the Mayan culture and get to meet more of the Mayan people themselves. This is actually Ambergris Key in Belize, and you can see in the picture the traditional Mayan-style hut there, along with the more modern conveniences. And this area, of course, is part of the greater Central America. Of course, we're coming down the coast of Cozumel's on the very top of the map there, and Belize City is on the coast, but we're going down to the bay near Puerto Barrios. But this whole stretch of land, I talked yesterday about how it's a very new land geologically. The last 200 million years, it's risen by the tectonic plates and separated the Pacific from the Atlantic, and such that the Caribbean Sea is now a semi-enclosed sea where it used to flow through. And it's the west coast is very rough because it gets full swells and waters, but the Caribbean coast is very placid and tranquil, except for the hurricanes and some weather. But there's almost only 1 foot of tide all through the Atlantic coast, meaning that a lot of these shore villages are very tranquil, all the way down to Panama, up into the great reefs off of Belize. Now we're going to go, of course, just to a bit of Guatemala, then back up the coast. So we will have, for another trip, we go to all these places, Costa Rica, Panama. I'm sure you've been to them, but this was a very, let's say, an afflicted part of the world for millennia, it seems, because the Mayans were a very warlike culture, and then when the Spanish conquistadores came looking for gold, they were fairly ruthless, and all these lands were settled and parceled out by the Spanish, and then other adventurers would come. There were Scottish colonies, Belgian colonies, and business ventures to try to make a living out of this part of the world, which was not easy. Now, this is Guatemala, which is a curious country. It was divided up under the authority of New Spain, based in Mexico, and so they parceled out these different territories, which then became independent, became countries on their own. Guatemala has its main city capital called Guatemala. That's a Mayan word by itself. Antigua, an old town, Quetzaltenango, which is a market town for the Maya. We, of course, are in the Gulf of Honduras, and the country is divided between vast jungles in the north, then high mountains and volcanoes, and then coastal regions. But it's not a very unified country, just because in every part of this nation they have many different native groups. Mayan, there are 22 different Mayan groups. There's also the Guarifuna people, who are African origin, who live on the coast but don't go inland. They are on outer islands, actually, and they're speaking a kind of Creole English. And then there's the Spanish residents of the whole area, particularly in the towns, and running most of the economy. But we'll be going down to San Tomas de Castilla, near Puerto Barrios, which is a major industrial port. But this is a very secluded bay, and it's a beautiful coastline with a lot of reefs and beaches, and has become a point of call for small ships that can come in, Belize to the north. In earlier days, when it had been disputed by all of the European powers, by 1830, many of them had become independent. Mexico, Central America, though, had tried to make a federation of all of these somewhat separated places. Back in those days, you had the fear that one of the great imperial powers would come and take the land back. Of course, it was the natives had, indigenous people had, let's say, the shortest end of the stick that they got beaten with often, but the competition between the French, the British, the Spanish, and then later the Americans, but you can see there were Danish, Swedish colonies, and those have largely devolved into independent countries. The first of the Spanish conquistadores coming from Mexico was Alvarado, who came and was given his hacendado, they call it, the estate control over this vast area to set up his own plantations and rule in the name of the King of Spain. And then in the freedom of, or rather independence movement all through Central and South America, then each country eventually had its own leadership, usually a caudillo, a military leader who was essentially the local dictator supported by the gentry, and then often in opposition to the natives. There was just always rebellion, always repression, and this is where even to this day these countries are still afflicted by violence. But the Spanish, built their centers, their fortresses, their beautiful cathedrals. This is in central Guatemala City. So the colonial architecture is the legacy of that era, and then, but they're proudly nationalistic and independent. This is the flag of Guatemala, which has its blue and white symbols and its, let's say, motto of liberty in 1821. But you see it was done by the sword and the gun, and that's the Quetzalcoatl, the famous bird of the Central American highlands, which was revered by the Mayans and other native peoples. So when the Spanish were, let's say, sent home, except they held on to Cuba, of course, their last colony in the Americas, then you had what they call the Criolla Society, which was the Spanish residents of all of these countries and their own economy and their own let's say, distinctions between them. But of course, in the cities and most of the country, it's mostly Spanish-speaking. But as soon as you go out into the countryside, you will come into, especially Guatemala, the indigenous people. The further south you go into Nicaragua and Costa Rica, the less of the native culture you have, partly because they were wilder areas, were not settled by the Mayans in earlier times. But here in Guatemala City, you have the Congress building and some of the classical Spanish-style architecture. We are not getting anywhere near there. We're at this Gulf of Honduras, and right there you see Puerto Barrios on the right side. And then there's this beautiful lake, Isabel, it's called. And that's a freshwater lake that drains in a, what they call the Sweet River, Rio Dulce, down into the shore. And for those who want to come back to Guatemala, it's quite mostly it's a rural area with a lot of drama to the land, mountains and shores and places. It's only a small part of it is urbanized or industrialized. And here we are again by San Tomas, this particular chart. So you can see we're not really that far from the Pacific. If you go over the mountains, then you have the other coastal culture, El Salvador and other smaller nations around there. But this is what San Tomas looked like to the first Europeans as they came in this beautiful secluded bay that was even sheltered in the case of a hurricane. So it became a port access into the interior. It was built up with mainly lumber, and then other mining products would come out of the mountains, and that's still the economy today. Well, at one point after the independence of these countries, they tried to see if they could make a federated state out of all these Central American countries. The problem was that every locality did not want to give up its local authority to where would the capital be. This sort of sinuous isthmus of Central America is delineated by mountain ranges and back then impassable rivers, and then communication, transportation was very difficult, and there was just no way to make a unified nation out of it without a more willing landmass. And so Guatemala became its own nation, and to this day they are in sometimes cooperation and then on other times conflict with their neighbors. And this was one of the last elected presidents of Guatemala. Abnez, who was a military officer who resigned to run for president in the 1950s, but he wanted to, let's say, moderate some of the land disputes and also the trade relations with especially the United Fruit Company that had come through Central America and set up the banana plantations. And in the mid-50s, he was accused of being a leftist with socialist intentions, and he was deposed by a military coup d'etat sponsored by the United Fruit Company. So this kind of a political turmoil has unfortunately been very typical in Guatemala and other parts of this piece of Central America. But when you go up in the highlands, it looks like this, these pretty, not tremendous mountains, but they're often impassable, and then you can see the volcano, this one is dormant, right there sitting in the middle of the valley. So in the uplands you still have active volcanoes, but they just had another eruption, I believe it was last year, where it created a lot of devastation, and emergency aid had to come in because one or the other blows its top every so many years. This is still very active geologically, such. And so the cities are mostly in isolated, rather on plains where they're far from the active volcanoes. This is in Guatemala City, part of the old town there, though it's very much a big modern city, maybe about 1 million people in the town. And then they have the outside rural areas, which are mostly indigenous. And the major port, Puerto Barrios, where we'll be near, is an exporting center for all of the fruit products, a lot of it now run by Dole. And the economy is still agrarian and commodity-based, from coffee to bananas to sugarcane, and some mining, some spices, and a lot of small industries. But it's a fairly poor country. And you get around on it on all these beautifully decorated buses and things. Now, when I first came to Central America, I was taking a gap year from my university, and I came down and was starting my career as a vagabond, and I came hitchhiking down through Mexico, and then I got into Guatemala, and I was picked up by the military because they were having some fighting in the mountains, and they said, "Gringo, get out of here." And they sent me to the border in a military jeep. I had to walk into El Salvador, where again I was picked up by the police and said, "You can't stay here, you didn't come with the tour," etc. And so I kept going, and every country I got kicked out of because they were all about to fall into the civil wars of the 1970s and the 80s. And this whole area was racked by conflict. And I was in places like this, sort of walking down the road and catching the local bus. And even though the people were poor, they were incredibly generous and friendly, except for the police. And I seem to get them upset wherever I go, but not on this tour. But the uplands are the heart of Guatemala. That's where most of the population is, and it is once heavily forested and then has slowly and surely been devoured by the humans who have turned it to agricultural villages, and a fairly vibrant Mayan culture goes on to this day. This is an example of one of their agricultural techniques where they do not harvest the corn. They actually bend the corn and let it dry on the stalk, and then they will come and pick it before it rains, and then they'll grind it into corn flour to make tortillas. And so this has been going on for thousands of years. Of course, maize, corn, is the great gift of these native peoples in the Americas to the rest of the world. And so you may see some of the tamales and the cornmeal dishes and things that are served to this day, and that's why I call Mexican and native Central American food is the original American cuisine, which now you can get even at that fancy restaurant. I think it's called Bell. Yeah, Taco Bell. That's it. And you can get a variety on the street. I mean, this is a society of, let's say, some privilege and some elegance in the cities, but outside in the countryside, it's fairly rudimentary. And these old Spanish towns are now, some of them are preserved as UNESCO or World Heritage Sites. This is in Antigua, different from the island. This is the old Spanish capital in the highlands near Lake Atitlan, which is a beautiful freshwater lake up in the high mountains, and is a place where many people go to get away from the heat of the lowlands. And so up in the mountains, it's quite different than where we will be on the shore in the steamy coast where we are going. Here is just a chart of how many different indigenous people there are. You can see where we are going to, it's called Garifuna, which is again a population of escaped slaves who came from various islands in the Caribbean, and then they came and settled to be independent on the shores and the islands off of this whole coast. Then you have the Quechí, that's one of the main Mayan groups, Mopan. When it says Castilian, that means mostly Spanish-speaking and not ethnically Mayan. But up in the highlands, you see all these different groups that are have a common background, but they were in history often in different valleys. They developed a different dialect, and they would identify themselves by different ways of weaving in their dress. And it is a remnant of the greater empire of the Mayans, which was never really unified. It was always disputing groups in different regions. This is in Chichicastenango, where they have this great, every 2 weeks, a big market. People come down from the mountainside and they fill the town, and particularly they're selling their, not just agricultural products, but also their fine woven goods. Now here's up in Chichicastenango, this Catholic church, which is particularly exuberantly decorated. And most people are nominally Christian and Catholic, though much of the Mayan religious belief and cosmology is sort of infused into their Catholic saints and practices. So this is a matter of the flexibility of religion to adopt and adapt to these people here. These is again in Chichicastenango, some of the Mayan men in their characteristic shorts and a cowboy hat. They're not dressed in pink though, like we saw in Cuba. But here you have the young people, and this is a population that has been growing so much over the last decades that the population has sort of overwhelmed the resources in many places, meaning the current generation is in some ways poorer than they were generations ago just because of the population growth. But nonetheless, you can see how the clothing and the weaving is embroidery is a tremendous cultural tradition there. And the women traditionally will have some sort of a headdress on, often for carrying things on their head. And here's a woman with her weaving come down to the market to sell, not just amongst themselves, but again, this economy has a definite need of tourism because their handicrafts are one of their major products. This woman, you may have heard of, Rigbert Menchú. She was from one of the upper highland communities, and in the Civil War in Guatemala, the military came up and attacked the village and burnt it down, and she was, as a young girl, watched her parents and her brothers all get killed, and she ran off into the woods, finally escaped, went to Mexico, went to university, and then became a leading advocate for indigenous rights in Guatemala and then around the world. Then she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. And I was reading her account of how she wrote a book called Returning Home, where after she won the Nobel Prize, she was determined to go back and see what remained of her home village, way up in the mountains. And she got there, and the village had been burnt to the ground. The land had been given to lowland business people who took the former Lush Valley and they deforested it completely, so there was it was becoming a desert. And this is a very common problem all through the world, but especially in Guatemala. And she came back and she said she could not hate the people who did this to her village and her life and the land, but all she could do was cry because the world had destroyed her previous life. And it still goes on because there's so many what they call desaparecidos, just people who are executed and thrown away, and it became very murderous, the whole country, as if there was no law, there was just the rule of violence. And to this day, it's calmed down a bit, but a lot of the problem with the refugee crisis, even now, is this excess population and the destroyed land, and people are so desperate they just leave as refugees. But there's some effort to try to preserve those communities. I mean, the international community has heard and helped out in some restoration of the forests. And this particular question is about a dam being built on the Rio Negro, which would flood out some of the lower Mayan communities. And again, the question is whether you need economic development or do you need to preserve the land as it is, and especially the indigenous culture. But you'll see that their children are everywhere, and this is charming, but it's also one of the problems in that for various reasons, mainly public health services and sanitation, the population has exploded. It's a rule of thumb in developing countries that the population doubles every generation. And in this case, Guatemala went from about 3 million people in 1950 to now 14 or 15 million, and on the same land, which is often far less productive than it was before. So that's the root of our problems, not just here, but around the world. This was the extent of the Mayan and its related cultures back before the Spanish arrived and the European impact. And it included not just the Mayan and their many groups among them, the Olmec, the Tolmec, the Aztec, the Mixtec, and all these other groups. If you've been to Mexico and the great museums in the city there or all these other areas, there's an incredible variety of not just ancient culture, but continuing living Native American culture mixed in with, of course, Spanish and the modern world. But this is an area with, again, distinctive mountain ranges and very distinct areas that are now part of a larger modern country, and you can get around, but they were often territory that was conflicted between the natives before Columbus and his crews came in, or Cortez, I should say. Well, we're going to be here, the Yucatan Peninsula, which is now a very lush jungle for most of it. And we will be going, well, you can see Cozumel is right up on the upper right-hand side up there. And then Belize and the reef systems, and then we're coming down to, this is where Santo Tomas is, right about there. But I'm showing this picture because it looks so lush and green. It had been pretty much deforested, and it had a terrible drought about 1,000 years ago, which was the demise of the Mayan culture. Now, in 2 days from now, we'll be going, after Roatan, we go to Santo Tomas, and then there's an excursion to one of the closer sites called Quirigua. And this is common all through Guatemala, in Mexico, Belize. A few sites have been cleared of the jungle and made access by roads or even fly into some place like Chichen Itza. And you have the ruins of what was once a large town and a colorful, vibrant society, let's say, much of which is only left in stone and a few archaeological finds of the stela and let's say they call logoglyphs of the Mayan language. And this was construction stelas that usually are in honor of the local king and battles against the enemies. And the language was not understood until the last couple of decades, because it's very both a logo, phonetic, and a kind of symbolic language all in one, so that once they cracked the code of their pictographs, then they could read who this was, what year it was, and what was going on at the time. They were usually triumphant announcements of the glory of the local ruler. The last of these was cut and raised in 886, was the last Mayan construction. And many of them have just been lost into the jungle or toppled over. The better sites and the more interesting ones have been now opened up to the public. But you can see the block logographs, they call them, with human faces and then symbology of various things. And so the scholars can sit and slowly decipher what it is saying, just like we go to Egypt, and if you know enough of it, you can sort of get an idea of what they're speaking about, or writing in stone about. But one writer said the Mayan culture was obsessed by war. And perhaps this is still the problem. The violence of this area just seems to be unrelenting. But the Mayans were never, let's say, one unified, centralized nation. They were always one area against the other, and leading to these kind of monuments without much knowledge about what the local life was. They're trying to reconstruct how there were so many people living in what is now a pretty impenetrable jungle. But it was a very resourceful civilization in that they built aqueducts, roads, developed their agriculture, built their urban centers, and then their monuments. Now this is in Chiriquahua, which is also known as the Temple of the Masks, because they have these visages in stone that are in the park where you can see, and again, descriptions that go up all around the stele. We'll be seeing more up on the Costa Maya, and again, I'm going to give a talk in more detail about the Mayan culture, but this is what we can see in Santo Tomas, these inscripted boulders. Now here's one that wouldn't that look nice in your front lawn? Well, some of them have ended up in major museums, and particularly some of the great museums in Mexico collected a lot of this. This is Guatemala's largest complex in Tikal, which is near the border of Belize, not far from where we will be going. But it is characteristic, has a courtyard and residences probably for the nobility or the priests, and then they have their great temple where they would do their sacrifices at certain times of the year or of their victims in war. And so if you have the chance to go to Tikal or other ones like this, you're always faced with this incredible staircase. And there are movies reenacting some of the scenes of this, but you can get your cardiovascular regimen satisfied by just one climb, especially in the middle of the day. Only the gringos really like to do it in the sunny midday. But once you get up there, you have a view into the mountains and of the other temples that go off for seating in the area. And there are hundreds of sites that have not been excavated, and every year there's news of this, that, or the other that's been found. But if you get to climb to the top, you can thank yourself for getting there on your own, because if you were to be a sacrificial victim, they provided the conveyance up. And these young people, at least they kept their heart in their body there. Now I'm just going to go on to Belize, which is, again, coming up the coast, and we're going to go to Harvest Key, which is about central area of near the Mayan mountains. You see that mountain range, which is sort of central to Belize, and then there's a lot of tropical lowlands and agriculture and things, particularly to the north. Now this country was called British Honduras, mainly because the Royal Navy came in to clear the area of pirates. It was famous for pirate bands that would live in all of the reefs and parts of it, especially the offshore area. You see that in green. But the Guatemalans claimed the whole coast, and this was a dispute that goes back to the 1830s. And up till recently, the British Army would have a tropical warfare training base in that southern part that's claimed by Guatemala, just to make sure the Guatemalans just didn't come in and take it over. Belize itself has a very small population of about 2 million people. And so it is still, let's say, disputed, but that whole coast is also always under close watch because of drug smuggling and then human smuggling. And so this is an exercise between the Belizean Coast Guard and the British Marines. But it's fairly tranquil. There's no fighting over borders anymore right now, but the other problems have taken precedence. This is the Great Barrier Reef of the Americas, they call it, but it stretches from Roatan and Guatemalan coast all the way up to Belize and then up into Mexico. So this is one of the treasures of the Caribbean because it's mostly undeveloped and not impacted by pollution like some other places are in the Caribbean especially. And so you have these wonderful seascapes and then little islands out there where you can go out, and a lot of it's a scuba diving, snorkeling, fisherman's paradise. This is the famous Blue Hole, which goes down hundreds of feet into the water, but otherwise it's built up a reef around it, making this beautiful visual sight. There are some large nature preserves. This is on the northern